My name is Roger Buck, and today I want to tell you about my experience of being an American in Europe, and a little bit of what I've learned about Europe after having lived here for well over 30 years, particularly about European culture and politics. Now, I think that I should say that I'm only a first generation American, an American by birth. Both my parents were British, and I think I'll also say that I've lived in something like 7 different countries in all, beginning with obviously my native America that I grew up in, also Ireland, where I'm speaking from now, speaking to you today from Ireland. You can hear the howling Irish wind outside, maybe. And I've also lived in Spain, France, Switzerland, Germany, as well as Britain. And Britain, of course, is actually 3 different countries. It includes 3 different countries just in itself: England, Scotland, and Wales. And I've also had the fortune of living in each of those 3 different cultures. So, by one way of counting, you could say that I've actually lived in 9 different countries. All right. I raise all that because I hope it may help to illumine some of the things I'm trying to say on this YouTube channel, and I'm also saying in my books which are very much about Europe. But I guess I'm saying that I'm aware that I have a somewhat unusual life path, having lived in all these 9 different countries, and that is inevitably going to give me a different perspective than the perspective that many of my viewers and many of my readers have. But please note, I said different. I did not say better. Because my life path carries certain limitations. So, for example, I haven't lived in America since 1985. I've been back for a few weeks, but not much more than that. And inevitably, my understanding, at least my first-hand understanding of America, is very out of date compared to most of my fellow Americans. It's very superficial. It's bound to be superficial in certain ways compared to an American of my age who's lived his or her entire life in America. Or you could look at my experience. I've lived in Ireland now, something both in the south and in the north, 7, 8 years now. But I will never know Ireland in a way that, someone who's born and bred in Ireland and has Ireland in their bones and in their flesh and in their blood. I can never know Ireland in that way. But it seems to me that certain things can be gained by standing outside of a culture. So providence, destiny, led me to stand outside of America and see America from the outside. Or, coming to Ireland much later on, I see Ireland from the outside. And that can give a different perspective that has a certain value. It seems to me that God gives different people different destinies for different reasons that will yield different perspectives and insights. So later on, I'm going to be talking about standing outside of America and, a bit about the view from England, the view from France. But right now, I want to start by talking about, just a little bit, about my experience as someone who comes to Ireland from the outside. So right now, I'm living in a beautiful valley in County Tyrone, not far from the border of County Donegal. Here's a picture of my parish church in this valley. So I'm living, obviously, in a very rural Irish setting. And words cannot begin to express to you how moved I am, how touched I am by the Irish villagers that live in these little villages around County Tyrone, County Donegal. I am moved to my core by this. I frankly, in all the different places I've lived, I've never met people that struck me. There's a quality of community here. There's a quality of friendliness, helpfulness that is very, very genuine. I'm not saying that those qualities of helpfulness, neighborliness don't exist elsewhere, but I've never encountered them in quite the same way as I've experienced them living in Ireland. You know, I know that if I should ever leave Ireland, if I should ever leave, I really know I will never meet people like this again. And over the years, I found that people try to argue with me about this. They might say, well, you're in a rural setting. Well, I've lived in rural Germany. I've lived in rural Switzerland. With all due respect to the Germans and the Swiss, it's not like that there. So, the rural Swiss are not like the Irish. There's something very special. And yeah, when I first came here, I was in County Clare back then, I was quite blown away by the Irish. And people said to me, well, Roger, you're being a bit dewy-eyed, you're being a bit naive, a bit innocent, live here a bit longer and, you'll start to see other sides of the Irish. And, well, I've lived here 8 years. And friends, I'm entirely unrepentant. Yes, there are dark sides to the Irish. Every people is fallen. Every people has its limitations. But there's something here. And the point I'm getting at, really, is that often I feel the Irish can't see it themselves. There's actually quite a humble quality in the Irish. That's another quality that really touches me about Ireland, a sense of humility. I'm not saying that all Irish people are humble. I'm not saying, there are Irish egomaniacs, just like there are everywhere else. But there are special qualities here. 1,600 years of the sacraments have made an impact on this country, have left something here. And yet that's not so much my point now. My point is that the Irish often can't see these things, although I have heard Irish who've gone away and come back, and they know what I'm talking about. By going away and coming back, they can sort of see Ireland for the first time. But really, my real point here is that this experience of moving between different countries allows me to compare, to contrast, to ponder, to meditate on what I've seen. All that shapes what I'm saying in these videos and in my books. And yeah, I think maybe it helps if I give you just a little bit more autobiography. So I've said already that I'm English by blood. A little joke I have sometimes is that I'm an Englishman from Los Angeles. And I say that because I was born in a hospital not far from Hollywood. Later on, my parents took me to Oregon, Salem, Oregon to be precise. And then later on, when I was 16, I came to England, and I've lived in England many years. Most of all, I've lived in Cambridge in England, the great university city of Cambridge. And I've also lived in other places too, like Liverpool in the north of England. Anyway, let's talk England, because England provides the first great contrast of my life. It was a pretty shocking change for me. I had never been to Europe before. I'd grown up entirely in America, and all of a sudden I was thrust into Europe with very little preparation. It was quite a radical and shocking change. I think I'll also say that this was quite a time of radical political change in England. That's relevant because, as I said earlier, we're going to be talking about European politics in this video, at least a bit. And this was 1980. And Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party, or I might say so-called Conservative Party, had suddenly assumed power in Britain at that time in what was seen then as a pretty dramatic lurch to the right. In fact, I can still recall seeing this issue of Newsweek in America not long before I left the country. And not long after I arrived in England, Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States. And back in 1980, I celebrated all that. I was very pro Mrs. Thatcher. I was very pro capitalist. And it seems to me that, at least back then, that was almost like the default position of being an American was to be pro-capitalist. Didn't matter if you were a Republican, didn't matter if you were a Democrat. At least back then, it's like you celebrated capitalism as a virtue, as a pillar of American society. It's like capitalism was as American as mom and apple pie. And in the 35 years I've been in Europe, Europe has challenged me to see things a bit differently. And today I'm not a capitalist, which does not mean I'm a socialist either. I very much believe in free enterprise. I want to stress that. But it seems to me that, at least in practice, capitalism very often destroys free enterprise, or at least it radically compromises free enterprise. And it seems to me that there's an understanding of that that's often, dare I say, more present in Europe than it is in America. It seems to me in America, you still have more of a kind of binary thinking. And it goes like this. If you're not a capitalist, that automatically means you're a socialist. Ipso facto, automatic. But it seems to me in Europe that there does seem to be more of an awareness that there are many more positions possible on the political spectrum beyond that binary. And yeah, all kinds of people in Europe believe in free enterprise, but they reject capitalism. In fact, you will find all kinds of people on the European right reject capitalism, which makes obviously the European right in many ways quite different from the American right. So, for example, on this channel, we talk often about that great English sage, G.K. Chesterton, and the Anglo-French Hilaire Belloc. Both of these Europeans were conservatives in the best sense of the word. Both were men of the right, but they both vigorously opposed capitalism, a subject we'll come back to. Anyway, coming back to the contrasts between Europe and America, there's something else that's relevant here, something that I experienced very vividly around 1979, 1980. Because, as you'll recall, in 1979, I was still in America. I remember that Newsweek cover in America, and I remember how Americans were talking about Margaret Thatcher. And in America, there was this view that Thatcher was doing a great job. I came to England, and it was a very different perspective. But in America, it was like not even an opinion, it was a fact. And, I don't know what that Newsweek magazine says now, but I can really imagine, I can imagine the world according to Newsweek, the world according to Time magazine, back then, is that, of course, Margaret Thatcher would be doing a great job, because in retrospect, I think what Thatcher was doing was to Americanize Britain. And over the 40 years that I've been in Europe, that has come to really concern me. I've watched that Americanization of Britain. I've watched that Americanization of Ireland. It's much less so in France or Spain. But I am concerned about this. And in case I seem overly severe to my fellow Americans at this point, I want to say that America has great God-given qualities and beauties that she expresses that we're often very lacking in Europe. And I want to come back to that. But yeah, I want America to be American. I want Britain to be British. I want Ireland to be Irish. And France to be French. So that's been another part of my trajectory, watching the Americanization of Britain. But anyway, coming back to where I was in 79, 80, I came to Britain, and I was really surprised, I mean, maybe even shocked that, the British did not look at Margaret Thatcher in 1980 as this uniformly positive phenomenon. No, Margaret Thatcher was loathed and hated by a vast proportion of the British public. So, contrary to the fulsome praise lavished on Thatcher by the American media, in Britain she was widely criticised for devastating the poor and many inner cities. There was massive anger at the time, manifesting in riots and protest songs like Ghost Town by the Specials and Town Called Malice by the Jam, reaching number 1 in the British charts. And according to opinion polls at the time, Thatcher was the most unpopular Prime Minister since polling began. Anyway, all of this was startling to me as an American in Europe, because for the first time in my life, I was hearing different perspectives from America. In my American upbringing, Margaret Thatcher was uniformly celebrated. Capitalism was uniformly celebrated. But now I was hearing, for the first time in my life, very different European and British perspectives. And actually what I'm saying here may even surprise some of my British viewers today, because they may say, well, surely Thatcher was popular, wasn't she? I mean, she won 3 elections in a row, 1979, 1983, 1987. Wasn't she popular? And the answer is no, she was not popular. Thatcher's success owed to the division of the left. The Labour Party at the time, the Socialist Party, split in two. The Social Democratic Party, and a significant third force was created in British politics. That, plus the fact of some quirks in the British electoral system, meant that Margaret Thatcher never got more than about 42-43% of the vote, which is significantly less than, say, Donald Trump got in 2016. And even in that 42% of the vote that Thatcher got, the people who voted Conservative, many of them were simply voting because they thought she was the least bad option. In fact, all kinds of Conservatives deplored Margaret Thatcher. The party was deeply split. And I would even argue that it was the genuine Conservatives that deplored Margaret Thatcher, as I brought up in another episode. That episode is episode 16. Ostensibly, it's about Ireland, but it's about Thatcher too, and the indoctrination of the world. It may be the most important episode on this channel so far, and I hope some of you will check it out. Right now, though, my point isn't so much about Mrs. Thatcher as it is about the often startling differences I began to experience between American culture and European culture, and differences that extend to, even the right, the American right versus the European right, which is a theme I really want to highlight here. And I want to stress that all those years ago, I was once vociferously on the American right. I was passionately Reaganite. But coming to live in Europe, one is forced to ask oneself questions. Is it the case that, even on the right, that Americans are always right and Europeans are always wrong? Could Europeans be right some of the time at least? And yes, in terms of this question of the American versus the European right, there's another example I want to raise, and it's the example of medicine and hospitals. So, in the America that I grew up in, there was a pervasive horror of what was called socialized medicine. Americans, particularly Americans on the right, were absolutely sure that this was a terrible thing, even though, the vast majority of Americans had never experienced such medicine. Now, I'm not sure that socialized medicine is the best term here. Britain, the United Kingdom today, still has so-called socialized medicine, and yet post-Thatcher Britain is a fiercely capitalist country. So, it's not socialist in any way, shape, or form. Um, so, yeah, I think I'd rather talk about whether medicine should be in the public sector or in the private sector. And you find, huge differences between the American right and the European right here. For example, let's look at this opinion poll from the United Kingdom in 2017. It found that fully 82% of British Conservative voters believed healthcare should remain in the public sector, and only 8% wanted it run along American lines. And going to the UKIP party, the figure was even higher, 84%, even though most people consider UKIP more right-wing than the Conservative Party. Does this mean UKIP supporters are actually socialist? Well, personally, I don't think UKIP supporters can be described as socialist in any way, shape, or form. In my view, it just means that people on the right can be very different. And too often, we ignore the profound differences between the American and the European right. Okay, coming back to the personal realm, I want to tell you about an experience that I had in the early 80s that also very definitely has shaped me. And that's because after living in England for a bit, I went back to live in America for a couple of years. And that was because my mother was still living in America and she had developed cancer. And I went back to look after her until she died. Now, inevitably, that meant that I had a considerable encounter with the American medical industry, and it was quite a disturbing encounter. I won't give you all the details now, but I'll just share one memory with you. Towards the end of her life, my mother needed trips across town to the hospital. I guess she wasn't quite well enough at that point to go in a car or a taxi, and but yeah, she wasn't in bad shape, and these were not emergency trips. They were like a leisurely 20-minute ambulance ride. I think she may well have been sitting down, and maybe they just thought that a medic had to be on hand or something. I can't remember. And I was shocked when I saw the price of these 20-minute these 20-minute ambulance rides. The price was something like $300 or $400. And that's, looking in today's money, that's something like $900 for something like a 20-minute taxi ride. Not much more. And I felt something is very wrong here. And I felt that about many other aspects of her treatment. It was very clear to me that the American medical industry was making enormous profits out of my mother. And indeed, of course, millions of other Americans afflicted with cancer and, of course, many other diseases. And now, my mother wasn't insured, and so she was racking up thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of debt, which was then taken out of her house when she died. And so, I've come to really understand many Europeans who look at this situation in America, and it's really quite heartrending. I'm no expert on the situation, but it seems to me that over the years, many Americans have had terrible debts because of, medicine being a big business, and have been enslaved by those debts. Recently I met a British doctor and on the National Health Service, and he said something like this to me. He said that he'd met an American lady and she'd had some sort of complaint. I don't know what it was. It was in excess of $30,000 though to deal with it. $30,000, $35,000. And he said to me something like, well, Roger, I could have treated that condition in 2 short sessions. I could have just dealt with it. No need for $30,000 to deal with this. And I guess that he was horrified. And I guess that many Europeans, both on the left and the right, are. It's heartrending to see this. It's really heartrending to think about Americans in this kind of situation. It's like I really believe that one of the beauties of America is that essentially it has pioneered liberty and freedom. Essentially, at a most fundamental level, there is something very beautiful there. But when I think of Americans in debt traps because of hospital bills, or even, education bills, these massive, massive education bills, because education is turned into a capitalistic business in America, I've very much come to side with the European perspective on these matters, which, as I say, all kinds of people on the European right would be fully in agreement with me. In fact, if you go over to France, and as I say, I've lived in France, for a couple of years, you'll find, that the French right is even more critical of the American right than the British right might be. Whether that's the sort of traditional parties of the right or the far right party, the National Front, you'll find those people on the French right very critical of people like Margaret Thatcher, that they call ultra-liberal, for reasons that, again, we explained in episode 16. So, again, all of this is not really meant to be about the National Health Service in Britain. I mean, God knows that it's not perfect. I'm not trying to defend it as a perfect institution or anything like that. I'm simply trying to illustrate that the right is not the same creature in Europe as it is in America. And I want to highlight that difference for reasons that may get clearer. And another way that I like to highlight it is beginning to go into history. Because over the years, I began to read all kinds of European history and European thinkers. And I want to talk about some of those right now. So let's start with Charles de Gaulle, liberator of France in World War II, and then later President of France from 1958 to 1969. Because Charles de Gaulle was a profoundly conservative man, a sincerely practicing Catholic with a great reverence for the Church, as well as a monarchist who regretted that he could not reintroduce the monarchy into France. By any account, he was a man of the right, far more to the right than any French president since, and yet Charles de Gaulle said, "The social consequences of capitalism are not acceptable. It crushes the weakest. It transforms men into wolves. Collectivism is no better. It removes from people any desire to fight. It turns them into sheep. We need a third way between wolves and sheep." And that is certainly also what the aforementioned Belloc and Chesterton believed, that a third way was needed beyond socialism and capitalism. They believed in distributism, which is to say that economic power should neither be concentrated in the state, as it is in socialism, nor in the banks, which is basically what capitalism entails, investing massive power in the banking industry. And moving from France and England to Ireland, we could also invoke the great Irish leader, Éamon de Valera, who was a deeply, deeply conservative Catholic and didn't want to see Ireland enslaved to the banks either. So, these are just a few things I've noticed as an American in Europe, also as I've studied and explored European conservatism, And I wanted to highlight some of these things because, often when I'm looking at American commenters on YouTube talking about the right in Europe, I often get the sense that they really don't understand Europe very well at all, or, even that they may never have been in Europe, and yet they're commenting on it. And I want to say one last thing in regards to France here, because it seems like there's a perception in a lot of American commentary about the French reaction to Islamic immigration into France, and I think they're missing something, because while obviously there is a real concern about Islam on the French right, what's often being missed is that many on the French right have just as much concern about Americanization, the Americanization of France, as they do about Islam, or indeed even more concern about that. Similarly, there may be just as much concern on the French right as the left about things like GAFA, which of course is a French term designating the mighty American power of Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. So, friends, not surprisingly, I share some of that very French concern about GAFA, about the Americanization of Europe. And a lot of that obviously comes out of my experience of Ireland, which I write about in my books, because I'm very concerned about the Anglo-Americanization of Ireland. I mean, to repeat what I said in episode 16, Ireland is a small country of around 5 million people, sandwiched between the two colossal cultures of the English-speaking world, with all their profound Protestant heritage. That is to say, the United Kingdom to Ireland's right, so to speak, with 65 million people, and over to the left, the English-speaking culture of North America, with perhaps 350 million people in total. And all of this has had a far, far greater impact on Ireland, I think, than either Islam or the European Union. And this impact does concern me, because I've watched this Anglicization of Ireland. I've seen how Ireland once so resisted the values of the Protestant Anglosphere, and now it's taking on those values like never before. And I addressed this in greater length in my last episode, episode 22, an episode partly filmed in France, where I also considered the French concern for Anglo-American world domination via agencies like Wall Street and GAFA. But at the same time, I want to say something else about GAFA, because surely there's a miracle happening through GAFA, isn't there? A miracle of American ingenuity and innovation and enterprise. Because friends, right now I'm very conscious that I'm recording this video to you on an Apple Mac computer, which has been a real blessing and privilege for me to own, and to be able to work with iMovie and Apple Program. That's how I'm speaking to you today, through American ingenuity. And, I think of my publisher, Angelico Press, and, there may be, or there are, shadow sides to Amazon. But I don't think small publishers could exist without Amazon. A small publisher once said to me that the beauty of Amazon is that every book gets equal shelf space, whereas if you go into a sort of modern bookshop, it's all Harry Potter or whatever. But Amazon, whatever else it does, supports small publishing. It supports the wonderful Angelico Press that has published my books. So, I owe so much to Amazon. I owe so much to Apple. Thank you. Thank you, American ingenuity. And it seems to me that American ingenuity goes back centuries. It goes back to Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, even Henry Ford. Or indeed, Benjamin Franklin's pioneering experiments with electricity. And you know, friends, when I look at that historical trajectory of American inventiveness and ingenuity, I really wonder if there's a reflection there of a God-given mission to America, because I really believe that God grants different graces, different gifts to different peoples to carry out different kinds of work for the world. And America has done a lot for the world. She's frequently been very generous as well. And there's something else about America, something not easy to capture in words. So I'll evoke some images too. One of my favorite movies is It's a Wonderful Life, which seems to me so quintessentially American. Now, I know for a fact that many Europeans simply find this film preachy and sentimental. But to my mind, this reveals a kind of weary, jaundiced cynicism one finds all too often in Europe. A cynicism which entirely misses the fact that this movie is filled with warmth, human warmth, wholesomeness, idealism, self-sacrifice, sheer Christian goodness, I think. Now, I know that movie was made long ago. I know dark, cynical clouds are gathering over America these days too, but I believe that American quintessence, that American beauty, if you like, is still there, even when it's buried by all the aberrations of modern culture. So I hope no one here is seeing what I'm saying as an anti-American attitude. I simply think that Americans, because we have such a huge impact on the world, that it behoves us to understand the impact of American culture on the world in ways that are both good and inevitably bad. Because every culture has its positive sides and its negative sides, but the American culture is so powerful that it will do both powerful good and, at times, powerful bad. So, yeah, I wanted to say that, and I want to pay just one last tribute to America. And that is to the sort of conservative scene in America. Because I really, even though I've been emphasizing the differences between American conservatism and European conservatism, I really owe so much to American conservatives. So again, I think of my publisher, Angelico Press. Link below, again, to Angelico Press. And I can't see Angelico Press existing in quite the same way in many parts of Europe. It thrives on the support that it's getting from American conservative culture. Or I think of my friend Tracy Tuscherone, who runs the Catholic site Fish Eaters, link down below to that. And I owe so much to Tracy. She's really educated me about many things through her site, including things to do very much with the dark side of the left. Which is not to say that the right doesn't have a dark side either. We all have a dark side. But we're all fallen. But she's educated me. Anyway, friends, you may have noticed a new direction on this channel in that it hasn't been so obviously Catholic. I've wanted to speak about things like Europe, America, the right, conservatism. And yeah, I'm hoping, to be frank, to reach not simply Catholics, but all kinds of Christians and conservatives who care about the soul of the West, who want to conserve what is beautiful and true in Western culture. And in that spirit, I want to quote that great Catholic G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton, who was, again, a distributist, both passionately anti-socialist as well as passionately anti-capitalist. But my main point here is that Chesterton once declared, "I myself am working in defense of civilization, side by side with men who call themselves agnostic, Anglican, Methodist. I trust that in the end they will realize the name of the home they are defending. But they are all defending that home. They are defending marriage, which is either impregnable or it is nothing. They are defending freedom, an essential attribute of the dignity of man. They are defending the sinner, who knows jolly well that he is a sinner, from those who would classify him as a mental defective or a superman. They are defending property as the essential insignia of freedom. This is the work for rationalists, defending the rights of man, and it happens, curiously enough, to be the work for Catholics in the service of the kingdom of God. So, friends, if you're a Catholic but you have a non-Catholic friend who you think might be interested in these perspectives about Europe, I'd appreciate if you think of sharing the video. Of course, I appreciate people subscribing to the channel. If you haven't already, please subscribe and liking the videos. All of that helps me in this work I'm trying to do, which is, drop in the bucket maybe, but it's a work of trying to participate in the great work of saving Christendom, saving the soul of the West. And in the same spirit, I'll quickly mention too that my British wife Kim recently joined me on this channel. I particularly want to recommend her latest video. It's not only a powerful statement in itself, it's also rather autobiographical, like this one, talking about Britain in the same era, and also how she met me and we got married. But that's all I'm going to say for now, except thank you for listening, friends. God bless you.